Welcome to Insights, the podcast of Forerunners of America, where we're here every time to warn the nation from a biblical perspective, but also to help you respond in faith. We want to make a difference. And we've been talking about America in light of totalitarianism and how that's been emerging. We've talked a bit about censorship. So we're going to take a bit of a shift today before we get to America's version of Marxism. We're going to tackle that. I mentioned that in our last podcast. But because it's the beginning of October, we have got to talk about Halloween. And I've got an expert with me today, and he's a Forerunners of America staff member who's written a number of books. His most recent book is Unmasking Halloween. And so, Timothy Zebell, welcome to the studio, and thanks for joining us for this.
Glad to be here.
Well, Tim, let's start out first. Okay, the subtitle, The Truth Behind America's Trickiest Holiday and How to Navigate It. I love that because we want to drill down. We want to also know what to do with the holiday. So before we're done here, we're going to at least start to touch on that today. But how in the world did you even get interested in covering this topic and then writing an entire book on it?
Yeah, well, Halloween's never exactly been one of my favorite holidays. But my church kind of pushed me into a crisis of decision. So I was raised actually to reject Halloween. Grew up as a pastor's kid, child of the 80s and 90s when Satanism was a big thing. So Halloween was kind of the church's favorite whipping boy, or one of the favorite whipping boys.
Kind of a gateway into all of that.
Exactly. You had a number of self-professed ex-witches, ex-warlocks who were popular on programs like the 700 Club, who told these riveting stories about how Halloween played a significant role in their satanic rituals, and how these seemingly benign customs and traditions that we do, like trick-or-treating or the jack-o'-lantern, how they have these really dark, evil, sinister origins. And a lot of them were eventually proven to be frauds, but they sure riled up the church for a while and convinced a lot of people that Halloween was a gateway to the occult. And as a pastor's kid, well, you combine that with the idea that we seem to be celebrating a lot of evil in Halloween. Our family just, we rejected it. We actually escaped. When I was young, we were in a subdivision. And so we'd have trick-or-treaters come to the door. So on Halloween, we would escape the house so we wouldn't have to deal with the trick-or-treaters. Go to McDonald's and play in the play equipment or something like that. And, you know, our church did harvest parties as an alternative for kids who were interested in Halloween. But then we eventually moved to the countryside, and we're at a church that no longer did anything for Halloween. We didn't have trick-or-treaters coming to the door, and so it became easy just to ignore the holiday. And so most of my time growing up, we just ignored Halloween. So when I ended up with family, I figured I'd carry on the tradition. We'd just ignore Halloween. But then my church several years ago decided to change course. Now, this is a church I've been part of for over 20 years, and they decided that they needed to capitalize on Halloween to turn it into evangelism, some sort of outreach. I wasn't real sure what to make of that. It didn't help that my dad was on staff, who was one of the pastors making this decision, supporting this, and it wasn't exactly in keeping with how I'd been raised.
Right. So, Dad, what's going on here? Are you waffling here? But anyway, yeah, just talk about that a little bit more in terms of how the discussion at church then becomes a crisis for you.
Yeah, so the first event that our church did, I wasn't sure what to do. I participated in every single event that our church did. And now I'm going, well, is it really okay for me to be participating in this? It doesn't match what I've always understood about the holiday. I never really answered the question, should Christians celebrate Halloween? But it was kind of a given in my mind, you don't. So now to have the church putting its stamp of approval, if you would, on the holiday, this wasn't just a harvest party or some sort of alternative. This was capitalizing on Halloween itself. So I actually semi-boycotted that first event at our church. I participated in an element of it that I thought I could, and then skipped the rest of it. But it started me asking tough questions. Questions like, is this a holiday that can be redeemed, like our church is trying to do? Should it be redeemed? What does it actually look like to redeem a holiday? Like, does it look like what my church is doing, or does it look
Mhm.
something different?
Mhm.
And it didn't help too that at that time you were encouraging me to look into the holiday for some articles because you were asking questions about, are there possible national consequences to our nation embracing a holiday that seems to be focused on promoting evil and celebrating that evil. So you put those two together, and my kids, I've got two
Can I,
little girls.
I just have to interject, Tim, keep going here in a second, but just for everybody listening, it was like, it's not that I was thinking like getting candy is evil or whatever, but what it was uh, like whether you're in the neighborhood and you're seeing all these creepy looking figures that are, made out of sheets and whatever, but the skeletons, but it was like, are we celebrating everything that's on the spiritual dark side, like ghosts and goblins versus God's glory and angels? And that was part of what I was, surfacing with you, 2, 3 years ago or whatever it was. And it was that, if there is a kingdom of light and there's a kingdom of darkness, as a lot of what's going on here on Halloween, is it part of actually celebrating that darker spiritual side. And so anyway, I found that interesting even as I read your new book in terms of how you think about that and navigate that. But anyway, so that was more of what I was asking. And now go back to, your own girls.
Yeah, so you got that tension of you're asking questions of, are there national consequences for what seems to be an embracing of the kingdom of darkness, and my church on the other side saying, well, we can use this as a gateway to get people into the kingdom of light, and
Mm.
going, is that even possible? What does that look like? And then I got two little girls who were reaching the point where they could start to ask questions. They were getting one message from me, and then they were going to church, and they were getting another message from their friends.
So these were deeper questions from your two girls than how much candy do I get to have?
Well, it wasn't necessarily real deep questions, but it's like, why don't we do this? Is it okay to do this?
Hmm.
What is this? Why are people setting up all these gross decorations in their yard? But then they're going to church and they're saying, well, my daddy says this about Halloween, and then their friends would say, oh, but my mommy and daddy say it's just a holiday for candy. It's just a holiday for fun. It's things that didn't seem to jive with what I was telling them, and so there's confusion. They hated the decorations. I mean, I've got some houses nearby that turn their lawns into mini hellscapes. We go into the store and you'd have the decapitated heads and the zombies and all the ghoulish decor.
With the
And
blood.
with the blood. And I
Yes.
got two little princesses. I mean,
Right.
unicorns, princesses, glitter, all things pink. So this isn't exactly their cup of tea. And they were young enough that it was really kind of scary for them. And so they'd be talking about how scared they were about the different things that they were seeing. And so just, put all this together, and it put me in a position that I never really thought I would be in, because I thought it was simple enough. You just ignore the holiday. No big deal, right? But now the conflicting messages from my girls, the emotions of my girls, my church, my work, all of it coming together, encouraging me to think a little bit deeper about this. And so as I started to, um, was very surprised to find out how complicated this issue is. I mean, I thought it was as simple as this. Some people say it's a pagan holiday. Some people say it's a Christian holiday that goes back to Roman Catholicism and All Saints' Day. Some people say it's just a community holiday. It's entirely secular, centered around community events. And so I thought, okay, those are pretty extreme differences. Surely they can't all be right. So which is it? And I thought it'd be simple enough. You just figure out which one of those, and that'll probably answer most of my questions. Turns out they can't all three be right.
So when I was reading your book, it's fascinating to see how you part and parcel, or I should say, really go down some different paths on where did this holiday come from. So I know we can't cover everything, but the first part of your book is uh, understanding Halloween, the history, and all that kind of stuff. The second part is what do you do with it? So that's super helpful and practical, of course. But just Give us a little bit about what you just said. It's a pagan holiday, it's a secular holiday. Oh, maybe not pagan, maybe not secular, maybe it's actually got Christian roots. Like, talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, obviously this is fairly complicated. So maybe just some highlights. Uh, to some degree, all three of those claims are in fact correct. The origin of Halloween is so ancient that we don't really know where it starts. Most folklorists will trace it back to a pre-Christian ancient Celtic festival called Samhain. Now, it's not spelled the way it sounds. It looks like it should be pronounced Samhain,
Hmm.
but it's really Samhain or Samhain, depending on your preference. And there's almost universal acknowledgement now that this is the origin of Halloween. It turns out almost everything we think we know about the holiday is speculative. Like we know a lot of things about it. We're just not necessarily sure where in history they are. So we don't know how much we're reading into history, things that would develop centuries later, versus things that actually were the original versions of the holiday. But Samhain was a community festival. It was one of the few times. It's right at the harvest time, transition from summer's end to going into winter, kind of the light half of the year, moving into the dark half of the year is the way they thought. And uh, this is a form of paganism that sees something spiritual in everything. So as it is in heaven, so it is on earth. So if the sun is waning, well, then we need to do things on earth to reflect it back up to heaven. So we'll build bonfires to fuel the sun again. And there were definitely religious aspects in that sense, but for the most part, this was just a community event. This was celebrating the harvest having come in. We got ready access to alcohol. The chores and the work to get ready for winter are now finished, and it was just like a perfect combination for a big party.
Hmm.
But along the way, we end up with this. Uh, he was a military engineer named Charles Valency, who fancied himself a historian in the 1700s, and he's fascinated with the Celts, and he ends up speaking into writing on. He writes this multi-volume opus on the histories of the Celts, but he addresses Samhain. And he veers off from what everyone before him has said, that Samhain simply means summer's end. And instead says, no, Samhain is actually the name of a Celtic deity. It's a deity that also might be known as Belsab, and it translates to the Lord of Death. So he talks about how Samhain is actually a festival to cajole, to appease the Lord of Death, and it involved human sacrifices, among other things.
So this is not necessarily based on historical facts, but somehow he comes up with this.
Yeah, we're not sure where he gets it exactly, but you're right. It's not historical fact. And in fact, within his own lifetime, he was decried as having, in the journals, as having written more nonsense than any other man of his time.
Hmm.
Like it was known within his lifetime that this was fictitious, that this didn't match what we did think we understood about the Celts. Nonetheless, his book is one of the only books addressing Halloween for centuries. So we end up with this fictional account, really you could call it historical fiction, this fictional account of the origins of Halloween that becomes the bedrock for what a lot of the conservative or more conservative Christians in the 80s and 90s will end up using to say this is a satanic holiday that celebrates the Lord of Death. Now, you can combine that actually with Roman historians. So the Roman historians are where we get the rest of our understanding, or a lot of our other understanding, I should say, of the Celts. The Celts didn't write down their practices. And so what we end up with are centuries later, we have their enemies, the Romans, writing about their practices, or the Roman Catholic monks who are seeking to Christianize the Celts. Both of them have every incentive to not fully understand and appreciate the practices of the Celts, and every incentive to misrepresent, where convenient, what's going on for their agenda, to further their agenda.
Mm.
And so we have to take it all with a grain of salt. And the Roman historians particularly, I mean, some of the stuff the Roman historians say is, I mean, it's obviously exaggerations and distortions. But perhaps one of those has become a favorite urban legend, if you would, among Christians when it comes to the origin of Halloween, and that's the Wicker Man. So we've got this account of a giant cage made in the form of a man out of wicker. And they would put humans in it and then supposedly light them on fire to offer them as human sacrifices. That is, as far as we can tell, an urban legend propagated by the Romans, but there's no evidence anything like that ever happened. Human sacrifice did occur at times and whatnot, but not in the way that we were being told, and not necessarily in connection with Samhain. So it turns out that one actually might have something to do more with initiation rites. They might be combining several different accounts. The Roman historians might be combining several different accounts, conflating them all together. One of the chief accounts being this ritual. If you were trying to get into kind of the religious elitist class and become a druid or something like that, they would dig this pit in the ground. They'd put you in the pit, and then above it they would build this hut out of hemp, which has, you know, it comes from the same plant we get marijuana. And while you can get sick with hemp, there are still abilities to have transcendental experiences if you inhale enough of the fumes from this plant, which they would light on fire above this pit. And you would end up acting out in this ritual the idea that you're dying to your old self and you're being reborn into this new enlightened state. And along the way, you'd inhale enough fumes to have an unhooking, where you would enter into the other world of the Celts. It would be their transcendental experience.
Mm-hmm. So maybe hallucinating a bit?
Somewhat, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so we combine that with other traditions, and we end up somewhere along the way, it all conflating together to becoming the burning wicker man for human sacrifices on Samhain, that then migrate to the Christian camp in the 80s and 90s, where the Christians are saying, you see, this is the devil's holiday.
Mm-hmm.
Pagan origins, certainly. Pagan influences, certainly. Is it the devil's holiday? No. Have there been those who have turned it into the devil's holiday? Yes. The neo-pagans have made Halloween a high holiday. And so it's not uncommon for groups like Wicca, for example, to elevate Halloween. They'll often differentiate their version of Halloween with the pagan elements from the frivolities of our cultural practice by going back to the old name of Samhain. But Samhain is certainly where we get a lot of the idea that this has pagan origins.
Okay, so that's the pagan origins of this holiday. So let's shift here a bit, because you also go into some extensive explaining of really All Saints Day with the Catholic, and now this is coming into more of the Christian realm. So where does Halloween come from in this realm?
Yeah, so the argument that Halloween is actually a Christian holiday goes all the way back to early Christian practices, where early martyrs were memorialized. It was not universally practiced, but there were certainly pockets around the world where the saints would memorialize, remember those saints who were faithful enough to give up everything for their faith. And this will eventually morph into All Saints Day with Roman Catholicism. And there's quite a journey how that happens, and there's arguments about whether or not the Roman Catholic Church is pirating from holidays like Samhain or the Roman Lemuria, these other festivals celebrating the dead within pagan traditions. Or if, in fact, there's another argument that says that the Roman Catholic Church is the one who really emphasized this holiday for the dead, and the pagan traditions took these practices that already existed in some form but weren't really a big deal and made them into a much bigger deal to counteract the church. So this is really just one of those holidays that is filled with uncertainties, speculation, and assumptions. So we don't know, was it originally a pagan holiday that influenced Christianity or vice versa?
Hmm.
But the Christian tradition will build this into Hallowtide. And so you end up with All Saints' Day and the eve of All Saints' Day, which was known also as All Hallows' Day. So we have Halloween, Hallows Eve.
Mhm.
And then you'll have All Souls' Day that will come in later. And that certainly is influenced by the Celtic, Irish Catholic monks who developed the doctrine of purgatory and then kind of bring it into a third element for that Christian Hallowtide. But we end up with a real conflict between Roman Catholics and Protestants, which, interestingly enough, the birth of Protestantism is believed to have been on Halloween when Martin
Right.
Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door.
In Madison, Wisconsin, we had when we lived there for 9 years, we attended a church, and that's what was celebrated, Reformation Day, and
Yep.
and it was a replacement for Halloween and all the dark side that you were referring to earlier.
Yeah, so Protestantism is birthed not really out of the Halloween traditions, but just interestingly enough, on Halloween. But Protestantism rejects purgatory. They reject the idea of mediators, so the idea of having to pray for the souls of those who are departed. They reject all of that, or the idea of praying to souls to intervene on your behalf to God, to put in a good word for you to God, which was some of what was going on with All Saints' Day. So Protestantism is rejecting these Catholic traditions, and then we end up with an assassination attempt
Guy
by
Fawkes Day. Go for it. I didn't know nothing about that till I read your book. Go for it.
yes, Guy Fawkes, the 5th of November. He's caught trying to light 36 barrels of gunpowder flame underneath or really adjacent to the House of Lords when it's in session. And so this is like trying to blow up the U.S. Capitol building during the State of the Union address. I mean, you've got the whole government there and a Protestant King James.
And why is he trying to blow it up?
Because it's Protestant King James, and this is a Catholic. And so this is an attempt to decapitate the Protestant government. Well, he's caught. He ends up being executed. They celebrate the day as a day where God protected the king. They burn effigies of Guy Fawkes. They burn effigies of the Pope, and it becomes quite the celebration. And 5th of November is so close to October 31st, where we've got Halloween, November 1st, All Saints' Day, and November 2nd, All Souls' Day, the Hallowtide of the Catholics, which was no longer allowed to be practiced in England, that it didn't take long for the kind of a conflation of the two holidays. The aspects of Hallowtide that the Protestants missed got imported into Guy Fawkes Day, which was an acceptable holiday because, well, this is a holiday when the Protestants celebrate how God blessed the Protestants and protected them against the evil Catholics.
Wow. Wow. Okay, we could talk. We're just going to have to read your book, okay? I mean, because this could go on for quite some time here. But that's a great summary. Now, secular origins for the holiday.
Yeah, so Guy Fawkes Day ends up migrating to the New World. You actually have Hallowtide and Guy Fawkes Day both migrating to the New World. But by the time they get to the New World, we're already starting to forget the true origins of a lot of this. And then we end up with the Revolutionary War. And Guy Fawkes Day is an anti-Catholic holiday. The Protestant colonies are celebrating Guy Fawkes Day. And in the Revolutionary War, we have leaders like George Washington who say, well, wait a minute, if we really want help, we want allies from the Catholic French in Canada, maybe we shouldn't be poking fun at them in our Guy Fawkes celebrations. So they don't exactly outlaw it, but they strongly discourage it. And Guy Fawkes essentially stops being celebrated for the most part. And so there's an extended period where the celebrations from Europe are kind of lost. A lot of the meaning of them are lost, so that when they reboot on the other side of the Civil War, they really reboot in a whole different way. Something we call play parties, and our Halloween traditions that we celebrate today really trace more back to these play parties than they do to anything in the European tradition. It won't be for quite a while later when we get into the Victorian era when the European traditions get reconnected with the new traditions we've developed in the New World. And we kind of end up full circle. But by the time we've done that, there's all sorts of fun stuff in the Victorian era on how we romanticize elements from the European history, and we mix parts that we like or parts that we wish were true from the European train with the parts that we really enjoy in our train. We have the urbanization that's going on. There's just a lot of social things going on in our country that will transform it into a children's holiday eventually, and then eventually ages back up, especially with the boomer generation, to being an adult holiday again, to really become the Halloween that we know and think of today.
Wow, fascinating. I know you get into so much more detail in the book, so helpful and so forth. So this thing has this long history and it's hard to sort out. Okay, but now, how big is Halloween? Like, I mean, I was blown away at just a few of the statistics you give us in the book.
Yeah, it's huge. The holiday became commercialized in the 80s particularly. I mean, it was being commercialized in the 50s, but we see it take a whole new approach in the 80s when you have the boomer generation, this influx of kids who have grown up believing it's their right to trick or treat. Trick or treating, really the golden era of trick or treating. That are now getting old enough that they're not really supposed to be trick-or-treating anymore, but they don't want to let go of their fond memories and the fun they're having with this holiday. And so that reluctance to let go ends up aging up the holiday again, which at this point has now been given over to children. Now it starts to age up the holiday, and adults start to reclaim it for themselves, or at least in part for themselves.
Enjoy it themselves. Yeah.
Exactly. And so you end up with a lot of businesses that start to, I mean, typical American entrepreneurial spirit, they see a profit to be made. And so you start having, vampires selling stereos and cars, and you have beer. Halloween starts to become a beer holiday, as at the time a relatively small beer company, Coors Light Beer, not yet coast to coast, is trying to figure out they're in to be able to compete against the big beer competitors who already own beer.
Are they the
holidays.
ones that introduced Elvira as part of their commercials for this whole thing?
They did. So their first attempt was something they called Beer Wolf, and it was really kind of this goofy looking werewolf type mascot figure. It didn't go over so well. But there was a very sexualized woman who's Cassandra Peterson. Her screen name was Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, and she's particularly known for the monster movies with monster culture. But she ends up being the spokesperson, the advertiser for Coors Light Beer, and they have these life-size cutout cardboard images of her in the store, and it was a huge success. Coors Light Beer was able to successfully transform Halloween into a beer holiday to where today alcohol is as much a part of the Halloween industry as candy is. And it would eventually actually overtake other well-known beer holidays.
The other thing about Halloween that's interesting to me is, what I remember growing up, and I don't know the exact evolution, but, there was a lot of anticipation of Halloween and going out to trick or treat maybe the week right before October 31st, or maybe 2 or 3 weeks or something. But now it seems like they keep pushing the date back. And as you said, it's been aged up. So now you have adults looking forward to Halloween in all of September and then all of October and maybe even summer into August now. But this has become huge in the billions and billions of dollars that are used both on decorations and the candy and all that kind of stuff. It's a stunning thing. It's a big part of America's current culture. So a lot more we could talk about.
Yeah, well, let me just add one thing real quick.
Sure.
You're right, $9 billion industry, but I couldn't believe it. $500,000 spent on pet costumes alone.
Pet costumes.
About 1 out of 4 or 5 people will dress their pets up for Halloween. But $9 billion for Halloween spent on cards, candy, things like that. But then there's another $6.5 billion annually for the haunted industry. Now that's a figure from 2010.
So haunted houses, or what are we talking about here?
Yeah, haunted houses, haunted cornfields, amusement parks that transform into haunted attractions for a particular night or a particular season. But $6.5 billion for just the haunted industry alone, and that industry kicks up beginning of September and goes on through. And you get some of these theme parks in particular can continue doing Halloween through November, even into December. I think the Walt Disney World is one of the ones that does that.
Into December.
Yes.
Stunning.
Yeah, well, and you have Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas that actually gives a direct excuse for people to bring Halloween into Christmas season. So beginning of September, the stores flood with Halloween decor, and the retail season really extends in some senses all the way through Christmas. It isn't until we get to the other side of till New Year when we finally see the vestiges of the Halloween retail items finally leave the stores.
Huh. Okay. So as we kind of begin here to wrap up this podcast, I know you've thought a lot because the second half of your book is about what do you do with this holiday? And can it be redeemed or should it be redeemed? All this kind of stuff. Now, it's too much for us to cover here in detail. We can read the book, but can you give us some perspective on redeeming the holiday or, even rejecting it or whatever? Because you highlighted that as that's how you grew up. So anyway, just share a few things if you can.
Yeah. So really, Scripture, I think, provides very clear boundaries. So if we're going to critique Halloween from a biblical perspective, there is a very clear grid that we can pass everything through to try to determine, is this acceptable? Is this not? Are there aspects that are acceptable? Are there other aspects that are not? And so there are definite black and white boundary lines. But then there's a lot of gray area, a lot of judgment calls, really matters of conscience. And so it's not a cut and dry question when you ask something like, can Halloween be redeemed? And what does it look like to redeem Halloween? But I do believe that Halloween needs to be redeemed. However, I argue that redeeming Halloween doesn't necessarily mean that you embrace it. You can redeem it just as easily by rejecting it as you can by embracing it. So really, fundamentally, redeeming, I think, comes down to a frame of mind.
Okay, hold on here. How do you reject it, but you're still redeeming it through your rejection of it?
Oh, well, it comes to this frame of mind. So I guess I have to explain that first. Romans talks about one of the ways that God redeems us as his children is to change the way we think. And so if redeeming involves changing the way we think, then if we apply that to Halloween, what is it that Halloween is making us think about? Is Halloween conjuring up images that are fearsome, images of the dead, gruesome images, evil? That's so much of what culturally it has now encouraged us to think towards. But what is it that it makes us think about? And then fundamentally transforming the way we think about the holiday. So thinking about the dead isn't necessarily bad in and of itself. As I'd mentioned earlier, we've got a tradition going all the way back to the early church, where you have early martyrs who are giving up everything for their faith. And so the early church is setting aside time to follow the instruction of Hebrews and remember their Christian leaders who instructed them in the Word of God and to learn from their testimony. So to remember their lives, to remember their death, to remember what they stood for, the courage that they had in the face of death. These are positive things. So it's really a matter of perspective. What's the perspective we're bringing to this? Well, we can bring perspective through rejecting the holiday, what it encourages us to think about, what conversations it encourages, what testimony we have in our communities through that process, just as well as we can through embracing aspects of Halloween. But I have a real problem with those who, and the internet is just filled with this, but those who argue we're redeeming the holiday if we're just simply the most generous givers on the block for trick-or-treaters, or our church hosts a trunk or treat party, or a fall festival, a harvest festival of some sort. If we replace the scary costumes with costumes of Bible characters, or we use
Okay,
Monster
so
Mash.
if that would typically be, I would think, churches that have held on to Halloween, that's typically the type of things they would do. And especially when you mention trunk or treat, you have your cars there and it's all Christians for the most part, but you try to get non-Christians there, of course, because you want to use the holiday. And you open up your trunks, very safe environment, you're all getting candy. But you're saying, whether it's that or the other things you just listed off, that's not really redeeming the holiday. In fact, you just said it drives you nuts. So, okay, so just give us a tiny bit. I mean, I know you cover it in length in the book here, the second half of the book, but give us a tiny bit of what would it actually look like then to redeem the holiday. Now, you already said it's our perspective. It's the renewing of our mind and coming at it through how we're thinking about it. But can you give us a little bit more practicality?
Yeah, so we've got those trunk or treat parties and so forth. Really, all they're doing is sanitizing practices that are secular practices, the typical Halloween celebrations that we're missing out on. We want to be part of the fun. We figure out some way to be part of the fun while easing our consciences at the same time. But it's not changing the way people think. There's nothing in it that is necessarily glorifying to God. So how do we change things so that God is, in fact, getting glory? It could, as I had mentioned just a moment ago, it could be as simple as just shifting the way where our emphasis is. So we can still think about the dead, but instead of thinking of the dead as this spooky, supernatural, fearsome thing, or to think of the dead as something that's intriguing, someone on the other side knows things that we're curious about. What if we contacted them? Could they tell us any of those secrets? Instead of thinking along those lines, to instead use it to glorify God in some way, such as what we said about martyrs. But you've got other things. Halloween is a time where it's a time of opportunity to bring the taboo out of the shadows and allow us to actually confront it, talk about it. So in our society, it's not polite to talk about the dead. We sanitize death as much as possible. We keep it in funeral homes, whatnot. We don't talk about it.
True.
And so we have troubles really grappling with death. But it's not just death. I mean, there's all sorts of fears that we have. There are questions that we have about the limitations of science and the limitations of modernist thinking to the realm of the supernatural. And these are all things you can't talk about because you're kind of kooky if you're talking about this. You're not supposed to admit that you're afraid of things. You're not supposed to admit that if you're going into a season of transition or so forth, that you have legitimate fears that come with transition. All of this comes out of the shadows and becomes celebrated in Halloween. And so all of a sudden, we can have cultural conversations that we're not allowed to have any other time of the year. We can talk about the supernatural without being kooks. And our faith is fundamentally a supernatural faith. We can talk about our fears and our concerns and the problem of evil and darkness and the increase that we see of that in our society. We can talk about that, but rather than go where everyone else is going societally with Halloween and just kind of mocking it, realizing, almost throwing up our hands saying, there's nothing we can do about this, so let's figure out a way to cope it and just kind of laugh in the face of it, to instead say, these are real problems and real questions, and there are solutions. The Bible's filled with solutions. In fact, these are superior solutions to anything that society has to offer. And we can get into meaningful conversations of a spiritual nature. It doesn't have to be gospel. It's one of the greatest times to be able to share the gospel. But all things about our faith, so many things about our faith, I should say, readily connect to the types of questions that people are asking naturally in society at Halloween.
That's why I really like your encouragement, admonishment to us to actually look at Halloween as possibly, that is, the most natural bridge to spiritual things, and then the next bridge is to the gospel of any holiday that we have. Now, we have other great ones too, of course, Christmas and Resurrection Sunday, better known by some as Easter, but I call it Resurrection Sunday. I mean, of course, we've got these holidays, but you're saying we can use Halloween in the same way, and we should. And so, it just is a different doorway into the whole redemption plan. What's God doing? It's just a different gateway.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I've really partitioned the book into two sections. The first section is the history and development of the holiday. And there's all sorts of intriguing, fun stuff, especially if you enjoy history. I've tried to distill a whole lot of complicated threads of history and bring it into an easily navigable path that highlights the major elements that morph the holiday into what we have today, and it being a uniquely American holiday today. But then that gives us the context to be able to ask the difficult questions, like, should Christians celebrate Halloween? Even questions like, does Halloween have an even more ancient origin than Samhain? I argue in the book that Halloween may actually trace all the way back to Noah's flood. I follow some of the monster lore, the development of monster lore, and how monster lore also can be traced back to Genesis.
Before we go on, that's not a familiar term to a lot of people, monster lore. But reading your book, it's a very interesting topic. But you actually do talk about whether it's werewolves or zombies and other things. Like, these kinds of things are in your book.
Yes. Yeah, we talk about what is the werewolf, what is the vampire, the zombie, how has it morphed over time, what are the origins of it, and then when we understand what it is, then we ask the question, can this monster be redeemed? Like, these can be some of the greatest tools for evangelism that we have, and they are the heroes of Halloween. You can't go through Halloween without seeing Frankenstein and zombies and witches and so forth. So we take that first part of the history and the development of Halloween and our monster lore and so forth to provide the context, the framework, to be able to ask the difficult questions. And so the second part of the book is focused on application of that. And the second half of the book is filled with scripture and practical advice for how do you critique a holiday? What are the limitations? And where is grace? And when we start to understand where the room for grace is, then that settles a lot of questions about, what if I disagree? I mean, I've got brothers who love Halloween, and they're constantly trying to convert me into being a proponent of Halloween in my family. They can have a very different opinion than I have on the holiday and how I approach it. And we can both be right, depending on what those positions are. But when we understand why and how that works, that frees us of so much of the conflict in our spirits, of that guilt, because so-and-so is telling me I'm wrong, or I don't comport with my other friends here, or what my church is saying there. It frees us of the guilt. It gives us a confidence and a certainty so that we can lean into this holiday as cultural influencers. We can be confident in our approach, and we can use it as one of the greatest tools for influencing society for the gospel.
And a along those lines, this is the book that I wish I had had 20 years ago when my sons were that age and wondering about Halloween and what to do with it. And I didn't know what to do with it either. There's this kind of all this creepy stuff that goes along with the holiday and how do you intersect. So anyway, this book, Unmasking Halloween, this is a great service to the body of Christ. There's just hardly anything written out there on this. And so thank you, Timothy, for all of your sweat. And I know it took an extra year or two to get this put together because we had this COVID thing jump into our lives and we were addressing that and other things in Forerunners. But now we're saying, hey, grab this book. It can make a difference even for this Halloween season. So how do we get a copy?
Well, you can get a free PDF download from our website, forerunnersofamerica.com, if you go to the store. But if you want the paperback, you'll have to go through Amazon. You can get there from our store, but paperbacks at Amazon, we also have a Kindle option. So if you prefer Kindle, you can get that through Amazon as well.
So go to forerunnersofamerica.com and click on the store, and it's going to give you, this is the feature publication, the new release right there at the website. It'll be the first thing there, both lower on the homepage as well as the first thing at the store, and then you can click on the free PDF or purchase at Amazon, and it's a pretty easy process. So anyway, that's exciting. And again, the subtitle is The Truth Behind America's Trickiest Holiday and How to Navigate It. Really, really good stuff. So thank you for joining us today for Insights. I hope this has been insightful, and this is a part of a Now message related to what's going on in our nation every year at this season. And this is not going away, not abating. It is actually ramping up more and more from decade to decade. And so get your copy of Unmasking Halloween. Now, we're going to be back for our next podcast soon where we're going to look at America and Marxism and what's going on. So we're going to get back into that stream, and I'm looking forward to it. I hope you can join me and my guests for that podcast soon. Thanks for joining us today.